Alors, bienvenue tout le monde. Melissa, do you have that? We are so thrilled to welcome everyone to Jacques Villeglé and the Streets of Paris, presented by AFUSA, the Fédération des Alliances Françaises, with Barnaby Conrad. Learn French, live French, and love French with the largest Alliance Française network in the world. So we have a few things coming up after Barnaby. We have Chef Alain Lenotre, who will be coming back, and a wonderful program with Sandra Smith on Master of Souls, which is a great book. It's one of Irène Nemirovsky's books that just was published. And then again, Alain Lenotre is coming back again. Just a couple of housekeeping details. Please stay on mute, stay on speaker view, and make sure you put your questions in the chat. We're not going to have people speaking out loud. If you have any technical issues, please just sign off and sign back in. And please note that this event is being recorded for our YouTube channel, and that the total runtime will be 1 hour. So welcome again to Barnaby Conrad III. Barnaby is author of 10 books, including Absinthe, History in a Bottle, Ghost Hunting in Montana, The Martini, Les Chiens de Paris, Les Chats de Paris, and Pan Am, an Aviation Legend. Barnaby has written monographs on American artists Richard Diebenkorn, John Register, and Mark Stock. He served as the senior editor of Art World in New York, senior editor of Horizon, and editor-at-large for Forbes Life. From 1982 to 87, he was a special correspondent in Paris for the San Francisco Chronicle. So welcome, Barnaby.
Thank you. Merci, je dois dire. Shall we start?
Yeah.
I think you have a pretty good introduction there from Renee. You know more or less who I am. So perhaps we should just go right to the slides, and I will tell you a little bit about this book and about Jacques Villeglé and his life in Paris. As you can see, that's the cover. It always reminded me a little bit of, it's obviously an advertising poster. It's 10 feet high. Villeglé, who was only about 5'5", was a master at climbing up and ripping posters that were twice as tall as he was and carrying them home. Sometimes they weighed 50 or 70 pounds of paper because they would be very thick, be almost like pulling down skins off of, say, animal skins, should we say. So next slide, please. As you can see, this is a Morris column. It was Morris columns were created in 1868 by an Englishman, an English printer, and Gabriel Morris, installed them all over Paris, made a fortune actually doing that. And literally everyone would go outside in the days before television and radio to see what was on. And inevitably, next slide, they were all over Paris. But here's Jacques Villeglé, who said, I don't need a studio. I had the street. He was an artist born in 1926, who grew up outside of Paris, but came to the big city as a country lad. And we'll see a bit more of him in action and hear more about his life in Paris. Next slide. And again, these are very physical actions by him, tearing down old posters and then gluing them onto canvas and calling them art. It was very radical for the time and still is in a way. Next slide. This is actually a very small work, but a close-up, and it looks like an abstract painting with some lettering speckled on it. We'll find out why he was attracted to lettering. Next slide. And the next slide. And the next slide. So this picture was taken in 1962 in the Rue de la Perle, which is actually over somewhat near his studio, which is up near sort of north of the Pompidou Center. And you can tell so much from this picture. In 1962, there's a referendum. Poujade, who was sort of an upstart, I think he was a grocer from middle of the country who ran for public office, and he was kind of a precursor, if you will, of Jean Le Pen, basically. And he sort of rose and then fell. But you could just look at this. You've got yogurt, éclair Danone. You've got all these little referendums, and I was able to date this by. There's no actual date on it, but it was a certain, I think it was Wednesday, the 17th in November or whatever. And so I was able to figure out when he took this. And I showed it to Jacques himself, and he didn't even remember the picture being taken. So he was quite surprised to see it. Next slide, please. This is a really beautiful photograph that was made by Charles Marville in the 1860s. And it is the Rue aux Maires, which of course would mean Rue of the mayor's office, which is on the edge of, again, just north of Pompidou Center to the northwest and near the Metro Arts et Métiers. And the street was built in 1280 originally. It was on the edge of Paris. There were fields nearby, and it also served the parish of Saint-Martin-des-Champs, so that implies fields, champs. And at the time of the French Revolution, this is about where Paris ended. Next slide, please. So again, Arts et Métiers is the metro stop nearby, or one of them, and that's Jacques Villeglé looking at a metro map. And I've never known anyone who knew more about the metro than he did. He and I took the metro around Paris because I'd say, now, where did you take this poster? And he goes, all right, let's go see. On y va. And we just dropped down. He was like, the white rabbit in Alice in Wonderland or something. And we, popped down in this hole and jigga, 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 jigga. And I tried to, he had stopped taking posters at that time. And we saw this incredible mass of posters on the wall there. I said, Jacques, don't you think we should rip it? No, we can't do that. We have to go. And so the white rabbit was always in a hurry. Next poster. The next slide. So this is what happened to actually the Rue aux Maires in 1991. There was a lot of construction going on all through Paris, and it didn't harm the part where he was. The streets are still very, very old, and there's some 15th century buildings there. But that's what was going on all over Paris, and certainly after Pompidou's time. Next slide. This is actually the Rue aux Maires, where 39 Rue aux Maires, but in fact, Villeglé was at 15 Rue aux Maires. But I just thought it was interesting because you have these Chinese symbols there for the Chinese restaurant and some other graffiti, etc., and street art, and Jacques is a street artist, perhaps the grandfather of street art. But the Chinese symbols are interesting to me because this area was in the early 20th century, 1900, 1910s, was largely Chinese. This was the biggest concentration of Chinese in Paris. And they were brought there in the early 20th century to make leather gun belts for the French soldiers in World War I. And they stayed on and flourished. So they're literally every store that you see there is Chinese. A miniature Chinatown, should we say. Next slide. So this is the courtyard of Villeglay's building area and he goes upstairs. He's got, we'll see it next, his studio. But note the little snail right there the escargot. That was a little sign, an advertising sign for the last shop in Paris that actually raised snails, fresh snails to sell, to eat. And that kind of business is gone. Next slide. So this is just a snapshot of Jacques in one. It's sort of a rabbit warren of rooms. He had about 4 or 5 rooms there, and he has there's another room that's filled with desktop laptops and stuff for his daughter Valerie. Kind of runs the business, and Jacques has taken 4,000 posters in his life. Some of them tiny as perhaps a laptop or a postcard, and others literally 10 by 25 feet long, mural size. And most of those are in museums. Next slide. So where did Jacques Villeglé come from? Most artists in Paris do not grow up in Paris. That's just a fact, whether it's Picasso or so many other people. They were born out in the country and in many different regions of France. And Jacques is a mix of a Norman family on his father's side and a Breton family on his mother's, but largely Breton, and grew up mostly around Saint-Malo area. And in fact, he has a summer house there, had one that I think the family had since 1840 out there. But that's Jacques on the left. He was one of, I think, 8 children born to his mother and father. Next slide, please. He was really, they were not an artistic family at all. His father was a banker, descended from haute bourgeoisie for several centuries. And his mother was from a kind of a minor aristocratic family and in that area. But it was a very interesting family, a very patriotic family. And you can really tell the story of France through his parents' branches of the family. One of them, the Gautier de Carville branch, were aristocrats who opposed the revolution, and several ended up dying on the guillotine. But his mother could also boast an ancestor, Charles Armand Touffin, who was the Marquis de la Rouerie, who actually went to America to fight for the American Revolution. And George Washington was so impressed by Touffin that for his bravery at Brandywine in Yorktown, that he made him a brigadier general. And on the other hand, Villeglé's father family was sort of magistrates and minor bankers, and they ended up fighting for Napoleon. But in any case, there was really no sign of artistic talent in the larger Villeglé family. So you wonder, where did Villeglé come from? Well, everyone's different. Everyone's on their own person. And Villeglé, one day in a shop near Saint-Malo, saw this strange book. It's a sort of a large book of about 20 plates in it. And it was a sort of a poem, novel, basically, short novella, if you will, called La fin du monde filmée par l'ange. And it was by Blaise Cendrars, and the text, and he was a novelist and poet. And Fernand Léger did the whole design in 1919. And Villeglé was able to buy this, took all of his allowance to find this. There were about 1,200 copies made. And he loved that. He was just obsessed with all the lettering. Look at that lettering. It's so different and strange and modern. So next slide, please. You now have an invasion of Paris by the Nazis. This is 1941, the Rue de Rivoli. On the left here is the Hotel Maurice, and on the back, then we have the Tuileries on the right, and of course the Louvre in the far distance, and very symbolic, of course. Parenthetically, my grandfather's sister was there at the time and was, in fact, she was head of the ambulance corps for the Red Cross, and she commandeered 2 ambulances and took them to the Louvre and they were filled with straw, and they put the winged Venus de Saint-Matthias in one, and they put the Venus de Milo in the other, and they took it out and hid those treasures out in the French countryside. Just a side story there. So next slide. Villeglé, his family was very involved with the underground out in Brittany, and the underground also was connected to in Paris too, obviously. So this is a carte d'identité of Jacques Villeglé. He was quite short and young looking. So they, the mayor of the local town there in Vannes, the guy gave him an identity that said he was 2 years younger than he was, so that he was only 15 instead of 17. And that in that way, see, they say he was born in 1928, when in fact he was born in 1926. But that way, the Germans could not draft him to do work for them because he was underage. But meanwhile, he could ride around on his bicycle and meet British aviators who had somehow slipped in on, on a train, let's say, and he would meet them at the train station. And then, even though he could barely speak English, he would lead them to his family's apartment where they would actually, pass the night or two, and then they get him out and get him somewhere, going someplace else. And he also would ride his bicycle around. The reason we have General Patton here is that when Patton invaded this area of Brittany and Normandy and took it back, Jacques was told by the mayor of the town to take a message out to a man who had been a student or instructor, actually, at a French military academy, where Patton had spent a year back in the 20s. And so Villeglé bicycles 10 miles on his little bicycle and delivers a note to the man there and said, "Monsieur, you have 10 minutes before General Patton comes to meet you." And then he rode away. He never actually got to meet Patton, but he saw the flashing helmet and he knew help was on the way. Next slide. Saint-Malo was terribly ruined and bombed, in part by Allied bombers, actually, unfortunately, but it rebuilt very quickly. This is actually a picture by Lee Miller, who was Man Ray's longtime lover and lived with and was a great photographer and photographed Picasso, etc. But I like the little black cat right in the middle there. He's licking his paw. Next slide, please. So the armistice, it was a great day in August 1944. And as you can see, everybody is pretty happy here on the Champs-Élysées. And next slide, please. So at the Liberation, everything started to open up again. Villeglé entered the Beaux-Arts in Rennes in September 1944, and there he met a young man named Raymond Haynes, a fellow Breton whose mother had died recently, and he was an only child, more or less. And they became fast friends, and they both were interested in the arts. And Haynes was sort of an orphan and enjoyed hanging out with Villeglé and his large family. I think Villeglé had 7 or 8 brothers and sisters, and actually two of them died during the war, I should say. One was killed in action. Next slide, please. This is a very interesting sculpture on the left. He was walking, he'd always been doing drawings and thinking about art, but one day he was walking down on the sort of quay down there at Saint Malo, and there was a bombed out German blockhouse there that had been bombed by the Allies. And there he saw these 2 twisted wires just in the rubble. And for some reason, they struck him as like a sculpture in space, almost like perhaps 2 dancing figures. And so he put them together like this and mounted them on a block of wood. And today, the sculpture, it was his first real work of found artwork. And it's in the Pompidou Center in Paris. Next, and then slides. Okay, La Coupole. Remember La Coupole. We'll come back to that. But next slide, please. So Villeglé and Haynes decided to move to, well, Haynes was a very talented young photographer, and he got a job there, and he just blew off art school, and Villeglé kind of went along and finished and got the degree, for a couple more months. And then Haynes said, come on in, there's a lot of action here, it's fun. And he had this little apartment in the Rue de l'Ombre, which is kind of near the Dome restaurant and the Boulevard Montparnasse. And in fact, I stayed in the Hotel de l'Ombre, which is right across the street from that little apartment. And they were, it was Bohemian life. And they met this guy, Guy Debord, who was one of the lettrists and a really strange, radical intellectual. And here, a nice little quote here. It was in Paris, a city so beautiful that many people prefer to be poor there than rich somewhere else. And, c'est la bonne vie. Next slide. They all hung out in a place called the Café Moineau. There's a picture of it in my book. This is that picture. And this is really where there were so many cafes in Paris, of course, and we saw La Coupole earlier, and we'll see some more later. But everybody has their own place, their own cafe, and you would find certain writers would go to certain cafes, and artists would go to other ones, or older writers, etc. Well, this was definitely for the youth, and these guys and gals did everything. They're like hashish, booze, romance, etc. And this is where Villeglé and Haynes would go to hang out. And I think this guy was a petty thief, and he ended up eventually going and joining the French Foreign Legion or something, and just to beat the rap for you're going to jail, you go to the French Foreign Legion. So this was this hothouse of brilliant people, and the most troubled and interesting was Guy Debord. One of his slogans was "Never work," which he wrote on the sides of walls, scrawled on the sides of walls. Next slide, please. So Villeglé, this is a place where they toss around ideas, etc. And one day, Villeglé and Haynes were wandering around that area, and actually the area down near La Coupole, which I mentioned earlier, on the Boulevard Montparnasse. And they had just eaten a very simple, cheap dinner at this little hole in the wall called La Soupe Merveilleuse. A great name for a restaurant, I think. And they walked out and they saw it on this huge billboard, which would lay between La Coupole and the dome, I guess. And they saw this sort of hodgepodge of lettering and torn. It was already torn. All these posters had been shredded by the voyeurs. So they tore it down in 7 or 8 pieces. They thought it was interesting. They took it back to their apartment, and they left it in the closet for about 2 weeks, and then they pulled it out and they glued it back together again. And they said, "This is a painting," and they called it their own Bayou tapestry. It looks a little like a tapestry or abstract carpet of some kind. Next slide. This is a much smaller piece. It's probably only about 12 inches long. But again, look at the accumulation of colors and paper and strange design. Villeglé did not tear these himself. He just collected them. It was like finding butterflies. And he would always mark the address of this one is from actually the Cour de Dragon in 1950. Okay, it's 16 by 20 inches. Next slide. This is actually a detail of in the Rue de Contentin, 1958. But he's kind of got his eye on the prize there. She does. Next slide, please. So again, here are the cafes again. And everyone who goes to Paris, they're not all the same, and everyone's got their own cafe for various reasons. And I personally will always go to the De Magot. That's my go-to place. And that, as it turned out, was also Villeglé's. And so we would go there and talk, basically. And it was a marvelous conversationalist, and I can't tell you every story, but he really knew, he met all sorts of people, and he knew. I once said, "Oh, did you ever meet Giacometti?" And he said, "Well, no, I just saw him walking in the rain once, or eating at a cafe with some young girl." And what about Picasso? Well, I saw him walking through this and that. But he did know Serge Poliakoff, who was a great abstract painter, and he also knew actually Tristan Tzara quite well, and would often have coffee with Tristan Tzara in little cafes around there. And so here's Tristan Tzara, the father of Dada, basically. He's picking up all these ideas. Next slide, please. Around this time, we're talking in the late 50s, General de Gaulle was certainly the most important figure in French politics, and a world figure, in addition to being a war hero. His Minister of Culture was, of course, André Malraux, and Malraux really made that post something bigger than what it was. And I find it interesting that he was a novelist. He was also a drug addict at one point out when he was out in, he was doing, opium and stuff like that out in Asia. But he's a world traveler, and he saw art not as a luxury, but as a cultural necessity charged with intellectual and political power. And in fact, Villeglé's work will actually be filled with a lot of politics. Next slide, please. So here's a slide. De Gaulle really had his hands full with the Algerian crisis, and this poster from 1960 reflects some of those political struggles as the liberation of the French colony of Algeria was pushed back and forth, and in a very, at times bloody way, but ultimately it was resolved for better for worse. Next slide, please. Villeglé constantly collecting these big hunks, as you can see. And sometimes he would keep them big. Other times he might end up not liking some of the pieces, and he'd just trim them down or cut, like that particular section with the R might have become a nice kind of section. But he did not glue things on. He did not collage. He's actually anti-collage. Next slide, please. There's a hotbed of, the left bank was a hotbed of artists and writers, and Yves Klein was a remarkable figure and a co-founder, really, of the Nouveau Réalisme, of which Jacques Villeglé was a major member. Klein's mother and father were both artists. Fred Klein, who was actually part Dutch and Indonesian as well, and his wife, Marie Raymond, who was from the south of France, where Yves Klein was born in 1928. And she was quite a famous abstract painter. And before World War II, she actually used to dance the jitterbug at La Coupole with Piet Mondrian. It's hard to think of very square, rigid Piet Mondrian doing the jitterbug. But he actually liked music a lot, and they had a lot of fun together. And La Coupole was a fun place. And Yves Klein had spent a year in Japan. He was fourth dan judo expert, and he really brought judo to Paris in early 1950s. He had his own judo studio. But he was a very poetic, strange, marvelous guy, artist. And this blue work here, he created this Yves Klein blue, which is a famous color. And it's a long story, but there's a lot of thought behind this. Next slide, please. He and Pierre Restani, who was a very ambitious art critic, formed a group, and many of them showed in this particular show in 1959, the biennial of young artists under 35 from all over the world were chosen to show there. And this is Villeglé with one of his larger works. That work, that's only part of it. It's really about 20 feet long. It's huge. And it really pissed off a lot of people because they said it wasn't painting. And yeah, it wasn't. It was a different way of making art. But Andre Malraux wrote to Picasso saying, "It is the art of the future showing its teeth." And that's pretty cool, I think, that to get that kind of recognition, and it's for real. Next slide. Pierre Restani had actually read Villeglé's essay on, he called it a new reality, une réalité nouveau, or nouveau réalité. But as you can see, it says the new realists have taken mind or conscious of their collective singularity. New realism equals new approaches, perceptive approaches to the real. And so they all got together and signed this manifesto, basically. Yves Klein, Le Monochrome, as he called himself, Restani, Armand, Jean Tinguely, Raymond Haynes, another guy, Francois Dufresne, Villeglé, and Daniel Spurey-Feinstein, and the young Martial Reis, who's still alive, actually. So next slide. Yves Klein, again, he, instead of painting just canvases, he was actually having women paint themselves and then lie down on a canvas. And and make a painting that way, a very different way of making paintings. Next slide. Jean Tinguely was the son of a Swiss mechanic, I think, and a hotel maid, pretty basic roots, brilliant sculptor, very charismatic figure. And this is, as you can see, the Eiffel Tower, and this was featured in the show at the Musée d'Art Moderne, which is just to the left of this picture. Next slide, please. Jean Tinguely actually married Niki de Saint-Phal, who was standing under the sign here, talking to Jasper Johns, having a cigarette with him. And that's in the Rue de Montfaucon, which is in Saint-Germain-des-Prés. And this was the gallery that, Gallery J, which became the hot avant-garde art gallery. And it was run by Pierre Rustani's wife, Janine de Goldschmidt. And here they are all gathering and smoking and joking and being very cool and avant-garde. Next slide, please. So one day, Villeglé got a call from his friend François Dufresne, who said, "You got to get down here. There's some huge posters here that I know you'd like." And Dufresne had sort of come in later. He did some posters himself, but he was really a poet. And so Villeglé went over there and they just ripped this thing down. It's 26 feet long, and they took it in huge chunks. And they had to hire two taxis, and put them on the luggage rack of the taxi to transport them to Villeglé's apartment. And that piece, I believe, is in a big museum like the Pompidou Center. It's about the only museum. Where do you put a 26-foot long painting? Next slide, please. Just a detail of that. But again, the imagery itself, 1961, is so pop. And you have American counterparts like Andy Warhol and James Rosenquist, who was actually painting pictures that looked like advertisements. Well, Villeglé just cut to the chase, and he stole the advertisements. It's reality. Next slide, please. There's Villeglé in action, again, very physical. Next slide. It was actually against the law to tear posters off the walls in Paris. You had to be authorized to do that. So I find this quite ironic when there was a film called Le Crime ne paie pas, Crime Doesn't Pay. And this is an advertisement for a local movie theater showing that film. And they all kind of had their own, as he said, their own colors and posters, and sort of like the jockey, the silks on a jockey in thoroughbred racing. So this red, yellow, black. Well, in this case, crime does pay. And that picture is in some museum, I've forgotten where now, but a regional museum in France. Next slide. This, again, the streets of Paris. You can almost hear the noise, the klaxon and the beeping, perhaps, of the motorcycle and the rev of the motorcycle. Jean-Paul Belmondo is, of course, a great movie star. And the film, The Man from Rio, came out in 1965, just about the same time that Villeglé stole this enormous poster on the right, which is about 10 feet high. And it is in the collection of Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris. And there's a little funny thing down here that may be hard for some people to see, but there's a little poster that says Petit peintre de Paris, devis gratuit, telephone, this and this and this. And it means basically, it's an advertisement for like, you know, do you need your apartment painted? And the little painters of Paris. So he just thought that was very funny, and it's there. It's one of the lucky ironies. He loved visual jokes like that. Next slide. I find this one of the most beautiful and sort of strangely fairy tale-like, magical and beautiful. It's about 7 by 7 feet, I think. And I'm not sure, but I think it's probably in Villeglay's apartment, to be honest. So I think he was near and dear to him. Next slide, please. Things were looking up. Here's Villeglé and Rastani celebrating with a little champagne at Villeglay's first show at Gallery J, and things are starting to take off. Next slide, please. Again, another enormous picture, and is one of the great ones. The title is Rue d'Esprit et Vercingetorix, La Femme. So it was taken in the Rue d'Esprit. I went down there. I found the street. It's way south of Montparnasse, and the cross street is Vercingetorix. And I found it kind of interesting. This was taken in 1966. There's a de Gaulle poster on the left, the little red and blue one. It says La France à de Gaulle. And then on the right, this little fragment of a François Mitterrand poster. And I found the exact poster. I bought it off of eBay. And it's from 1965, basically the election year. So Mitterrand lost, de Gaulle won. And the next slide, please. So here's an enormous picture. It's probably about 10 or 12 feet high. You notice it doesn't even have de Gaulle's name on it. It doesn't need to say de Gaulle because de Gaulle was France. Next slide. But not everybody liked de Gaulle. And it looks like somebody here had a sort of field day, sort of tearing things, and maybe there were posters laid on top, and then they were torn. And it's a very strange picture. But again, this is 1965. And next slide. But he did win by a landslide. Next slide. Things changed, though. 1968, student riots, trade union protests, and now we have deep confrontation, political confrontation, and you got it says La chien lit, c'est lui. The dog's bed is him. Well, chien lit sort of means the mess, or the crap, or you can kind of figure it out. But if you actually say it slightly differently, you say chien au lit, and it would be go poop in your bed, basically. And so there's a lot of strange wordplay, but these little cartoons of de Gaulle, I think, are very kind of funny. And as you can see, here's Villeglé on the right, standing next to one they were plastered all over Paris, but it was a détournement in the manner of Guy Debord. It was taking a word or a phrase and then I'm not expecting any calls. And so they were throwing it back in his face. Well, he ended up, he was very rattled by the protests. And then the next slide, please. This slide was taken in July 24th, 68, Rue du Temple, again, up sort of near Villeglay's place. And he was so rattled that actually he went to an army base in Baden-Baden just to figure out what was going on. Next slide, please. Villeglé himself was walking through a subway in station in 1969, and he saw the name Nixon, Nixon, spelled with these curious letters. They had made the N was the three arrows of the Socialist Party. The I was the cross of Lorraine, and the X was a swastika. And the O was a Celtic cross, and then the last N was again the three letters of the arrows. And he was so fascinated by this that he continued to develop this alphabet for the next 50 years of his life. But this is one of the early examples of that. And more on that later. So next slide. De Gaulle resigned. His prime minister, Pompidou, Georges Pompidou, came in, was accepted immediately, got France back on track, I think. And his wife, Claude Pompidou, was very interested in modern art. And in fact, in 1969, Villeglé received a check in the mail from Pompidou's office. And the president himself had actually bought one of Villeglé's artworks. And it was hung in the presidential palace. Next slide, please. Pompidou rebuilt Paris. We all know the Pompidou Center on the right. It opened in 1977. Unfortunately, it was 3 years after his death. He had cancer. And on the left, you have the Montparnasse, Tour de Montparnasse, 59 stories. And some people consider it an eyesore, but it's there. And Paris had to move on. Next slide. Valéry Giscard d'Estaing was a finance minister. He defeated Mitterrand for the presidency. He was 48 years old. And instead of building new architecture, Giscard saved the old Gare d'Orsay train station, turned it into a magnificent museum of 19th century art. Next slide. And this poster of Giscard was taken in the Rue de Royale, and it almost resembles, in my opinion, a Cubist portrait by Pablo Picasso, particularly the one of his art dealer, Ambrose Vollard. Next slide. So Villeglé liked Jean Dubuffet's art, and he liked it so much, and he liked the posters that were developed to advertise Dubuffet's show in '74, that he started stealing torn Dubuffet posters. And he did a whole series of them, 35 of them. And Dubuffet actually was very amused by this, and they ended up becoming friends and pen pals. And eventually, flash forward, but last year, just before Villeglé died, they did a show. The Dubuffet Foundation in Paris did a show of all of these pictures that Villeglé had done. So I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to try and speed it up a little bit because I think we're only about 10 minutes to go, and that might be too long. But let's go to the next slide, and we'll go quickly through these. So there's another Dubuffet poster. These are big, 4 by 5 feet. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And next slide. And there's Dubuffet himself, who himself was interested in street art. Next slide. Little Air France poster right in the center there. This is a big one from 1977. Go to the next slide. Mitterrand running again for president. Next slide. Somebody didn't like him that much, I guess, but he did win and did several septennats. Next slide. Socialist Party, etc. Next slide. Villeglé is still working in the 90s. He's now in his, he would have been in his 70s, late 70s. Next slide. The Minitel came in the 90s, and it was kind of a, most of you know, sort of a sex kind of online network for basically dating, etc. And there was a lot of kind of sexy stuff there. Next slide. There's another one. And next slide. This one was taken in 1996 down in Nice, but it's interesting because it was covered up by plywood for 30 years or so. It actually, all the imagery here in the posters date to 1966. And I like it because it looks so much like Nice. It's got the blue water and the sort of yellow sunlight. Next slide. Villeglé came out to San Francisco in 2004, and I met him a couple of years after that. That's me on the right. As you can see, he's not very tall, but perfectly proportioned. He looks like a jockey and very athletic. Next slide. Here he is in New York, 2011. He gets around. He also went to Seoul, Korea. He's been everywhere. And he doesn't speak English very well, but he just manages. Next slide. So there's Villeglé at 88. On the left is Martin Mueller, his art dealer in San Francisco. In the middle is Directeur of Lip, Claude Guitard, Villeglé himself at 88, and yours truly on the right. Next slide. I took this picture of Villeglé in the Rue Tourigny at around 2015 or so. No, or 2016. It was after the Charlie Hebdo murders, as you can tell there. Next slide. Villeglé walking near the La Palette, the cafe there in the Rue de Seine, on his way to a double show that his gallerists, Georges Philippe and Nathalie Valois, gave him for his 90th birthday. Next slide. And in 2008, he had done these posters for a show out in Brittany, and people tore them, and then he collected them, and he sort of, it's like a self-portrait. He's collecting himself. Next slide. And it's a very Andy Warhol-esque in a way. Next slide. And there he is, 2016. Pretty good shape at 90. Next slide. 90th birthday. I wasn't there at that one. That was his gallery. His gallerist did that earlier on his birthday. But the next slide, we see we had a gathering, Martin Mueller again, myself in the middle, Stefan Zegdanski, novelist who's written about Villeglé and Villeglé himself, and we're on Boulevard Montparnasse, kind of near La Coupole, which was under reconstruction at the time. Next slide. And so Villeglé walks down the alleys and streets of history in Paris, and we'll know him now only by his art. He died June 6th, 2022, exactly 60 years after the death of Yves Klein, his good friend, who died June 6th, 1962. But he's gone but not forgotten, and he had a great life. And last slide. In seizing a poster, I seize history. What I gather is the reflection of an era. Jacques Villeglé. Thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions, or maybe we have time to do the funny film at the end. It's up to Renee to, or maybe that's another session. I don't know. I'm happy. I'm here. I'm here to linger longer.
Well, I think we should see first, Barnaby. First of all, thank you so much. I think that many of the people in the audience may want to be able to buy your book.
Oh, great. Thank you.
So
Yes.
I don't know if Melissa has a slide for that, but it's an extraordinary book, and I think everybody should have a chance to buy it. And hopefully we'll have that information. And I don't see any questions yet, but I know I had a comment. I mean, this book is so amazing. What Villeglé has created based on everything that you've taught us are memories that are permanent based on something very temporary. And I think that's something for all of us to reflect on. It's almost Proustian in terms of what he's offered the world.
It really is. And I'm glad you said that, because the Morris columns, as Proust just loved them. Personally, he would run down there every day to go see what was up on the theater. And Proust died in 1922, and Villeglé was born in 1926. So it was sort of almost a football handoff, you know. And to a great extent, he is Proustian. And in years from now, we can look, you can just sift through this stuff. You can tell everything that's happening in the Pulse of Paris. I've just shown you about 50 images, and out of over 4,000 that he took. And some are so huge that you could write a thesis on, one of these huge, literally murals. Yeah. So any questions, happy to answer them.
So I had one more question. I'm not seeing any more in the chat right now. I think people are thinking at the moment, but
Yeah.
You look at an artist, a lot of us, and I honestly have to say, I was not particularly familiar with Jacques Villeglé, but I'm a huge fan of JR. So do you think that some of these street artists that we're appreciating now were specifically influenced by Villeglé? I mean, do you know of any that are specifically, aside from those that you mentioned?
Well, I know there are a lot of the younger guys and gals over there that the next, really, I mean, second generation and third generation, really, they know about him. And there are even some, I know there have been some younger artists who almost, paid homage to, sort of finding posters to tear, but they also, use the spray gun too, and spray paint and stuff. But for sure, yeah. I've seen. I can't give you a name offhand, but it's definitely, he's there. He is really a grandfather, and anyone who really, if they're really into it, they know that. It's sort of like, in pop records too.
So Barnaby, I see a question here from Susan Jackson. I think you said his work is not described as collage. What descriptive terms are used to describe his work?
He's almost anti-collage, actually. Collage means literally gluing or taking together several pieces of paper and gluing them together. And Villeglé does not do that. I mean, he might, if he takes something down in sections, he will put it back together the way it was supposed to be, the way, but you can't always get it a perfect pull. You're going to rip it, and then you're going to rip you may take a large piece down in 4 or 5 pieces, but he doesn't mix and match. He might frame it. He's like a photographer. He said, originally, I thought like a photographer. I'd go, wow, that's a really great section. I'm going to take that part, because he took smaller pieces before, and he would trim them. So he's framing them like a photographer, but he's not, shall we say, manipulating or collaging or gluing special pieces. He's not doing that. And he likes the randomness. That's what he gives himself up to, just the way a photographer, you don't necessarily say, hey, you two criminals, while you're robbing the bank, could you just stand over here and like shake hands or something? No, you shoot an action picture. You shoot what was there. And so he was quite clear about that. And I'm trying to think of something else I was going to say. But it really is a reflection of his time. And look, somebody from Texas is saying thank you. Merci beaucoup. À vous aussi. Very cute. There he is. So the book, if we have time for it, but I thought the book was going to be a smaller book. I thought I was going to write this book in 6 months. And it just got bigger and bigger. And I realized I had to dig deeper, not just into Villeglé's life, but this whole world, because he's representative of the Nouveau Réalisme and what was happening there. And somebody said, one of my friends from college said, "Oh my God, this is the graduate degree that you never did it when you were at Yale. You were just an illiterate art major." I majored in painting, but I became a writer. But I went down the rabbit hole, and I probably bought, I don't know, 300 books related to this. And I said, I've got to read about Yves Klein's life and, oh God, and Tanguy Lee and poor Nikki de Saint-Paul. And there are links to the Chelsea Hotel in New York. And it's between Rauschenberg and Rosenquist and those guys in New York and the French. I mean, there's a lot there. It's really, there's still more to do. Not for me. I think I'm done for a while. But I love the research, and I just kept saying, I got to get back to Paris. So anyway, I'm glad everybody likes it. The book is for sale on Amazon, and it's going out to various bookstores. Villeglé is having a show in Seoul, Korea right now. Or it opens in October. So the Asians they're interested in it too.
So let me ask you, Barnaby, we're out of time, but for those people that are still here, Melissa, I'm thinking, do we ask in the chat if people have time for the video, or do we ask if people would prefer that the video be part of the follow-up?
Well, we'll definitely send the video in the follow-up email that we send tomorrow, along with a link to buy the book on Amazon.
Okay, so
and also the link to find the video on YouTube once that's posted too.
Perfect. Cool. So why don't we do that? Because I see that some people are saying fascinating, merci, mais au revoir. So instead of losing people, let's promise that everybody, when everyone who has registered for this will have a chance to see this very entertaining and moving and wonderful short film video that Barnaby did. And when Melissa sends out the thank you for joining us. So on that note, we'd like to thank you very much, Barnaby, and we hope to welcome you again. And I hope everybody buys the book. I've really enjoyed it. I've read it cover to cover, and I'm looking to go to MoMA next week to see what's there. But I think so many people may not have been as familiar as they thought they were on Jacques Villeglé. And we really want to thank you for sharing his life with us and his art.
Thank you very much. Merci. Et au revoir.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.